Hello, everymany, and welcome to our presentation on understanding and navigating blurry or blendy plurality. With you today are assorted headmates from the Harmonic System. Before we get started, here are some trigger warnings. There will be some brief discussion of sexuality and consent, especially as it pertains to fronting. There will be examples of obsessive fear and paranoia we experience. There will be brief mentions of kinks, psychiatric trauma such as ABA, plural phobia, suicidality, and self-destructive tendencies. Additionally, we will briefly use a homophobic slur as reclamation in our introduction. So to introduce ourselves, we are the Harmonic System. Our vessel is white, in its late 30s, and was raised and is currently residing in the eastern United States. We are neurodivergent, autistic in particular, with some chronic physical conditions that have a small impact on our daily life and chronic mental health conditions that have a moderate to heavy impact on our daily life. We are a mixed origin plural system of at least a few dozen named selves, some subsystems, additional anonymous selves, a large number of fragments, perhaps other layers of headmates. We are blendy and semi-amnesiac. We are collectively non-binary transfeminine, queer, polyamorous, sex-positive, and kink-positive, and note that some selves are varying degrees of asexual. We also practice a nature-based spirituality, but were raised semi-conservative Christian. To give an overview of what we'll be discussing today, we'll be talking about blendy fronting and system structure, our origins as a blendy system, and blurry switching. We'll also be talking about how names aren't a big deal, how to address groups of selves, and handing off tasks and fronting. We'll be talking about ways of visualizing blurriness, managing inner chaos, analyzing blended fronts, and hijacking blended states. We'll be reviewing some effects of blended states, dealing with blurry amnesiac barriers, some communication tips, and thoughts on our collective identity. We would like to mention that we are limited to our experience and knowledge, so what has worked for us may or may not work for you. All of the URLs mentioned on the slides in this presentation are available in the Pastebin link, for which there is a QR code on the screen. This link and QR code will be repeated at the end of the presentation as well. So, what is a blendy or blurry system exactly? Well, let's first look at blendy or blurry fronting. That's commonly taken to mean when more than one headmate is occupying front in a way where the headmates are blurring together, overlapping, or intruding into one another. So when a system's overall structure has a similar blurriness or overlap, we can say the system, potentially subsystems within a larger system, is blendy or blurry, having a sense of some inner indistinctness. And fronting in such a system would often be blended, just like the system is blended. Now, note that indistinctness in parts of structure still will allow headmates to have distinct qualities or a sense of ownership for distinct memories and emotions. We may be indistinct or blurry in some ways, but in other ways we are quite unique and distinct. And systems with very distinct headmates can still have blended fronting states. In fact, it may be useful to think of those systems as blurry or blendy as well, because part of a system's structural mechanics include fronting, which is a dimension across time. So if you're looking at the structure of a system and considering behavior over time as part of that structure, then a system that experiences blended fronting could still be considered a blurry system, even if headmates are otherwise distinct. And we mention this because the difference between a system with distinct headmates that has a lot of blurry fronts and a system that is blurry structurally all the time may not be that different. So some of the things that we discussed today might be useful to systems that have a lot of blurry fronting but still tend to have very distinct headmates. So as an example of a blendy system, we'll talk about what our blendiness looks like. We often cannot really articulate or maybe even tell exactly who is front, because it might be several of us, or it might be one of us, but with different selves memories temporarily added in or mixed in. and switches can be very gradual events, providing a continuous sense of self over the duration of the switch. Some headmates are anonymous, or may forget or hide who they are, though others have very distinct senses of self and maybe specific names. Headspace often has a mixture of thoughts coming from different headmates, merging into something like a single stream of consciousness, but wider and more turbulent, more like a river. There's lots of fragments, which may be memory holders, but with kind of an unclear structure, which often blend with more elaborated, distinct selves to participate in front or just to communicate internally. So to summarize, sometimes distinct aspects of our collective life might belong to specific ones of us, but many times the sense of who is who and what part of our collective life and collective headspace they participate in is a lot more vague. So where did our blendiness come from? It's honestly pretty frustrating for our plurality to be so hard to articulate, as well as our plurality being different than most examples that we read about. So we have wondered a lot about why we are the messy way that we are, and we have also questioned and denied our plurality a lot, especially because of the blurriness. It seems that we may have some complex trauma around being punished for supposedly making up excuses when trying to describe our plural experiences around memory and behavior in childhood, leading to a kind of internalized plural phobia, where selves are afraid to be noticeably distinct in order to hide our plurality from ourself, especially due to fears around authority figures or supernatural entities being able to see our thoughts, making inner awareness of our structure off limits, and also leading to a tendency for some headmates to hold self-dehumanizing attitudes. Not only have we had to deny our own existences, but having to hide our autism and transness growing up also led to somewhat deliberate creation of headmates who fronted to help us mask those things, even hiding those aspects of ourself from active headmates while harboring self-destructive desires about the whole affair. So in short, part of our plurality may have developed to hide parts of ourself from ourself, with the mechanics of the system itself protecting selves from being able to tell we were plural, by preventing them from becoming fully distinct or having a clear sense of self. So that may have been a little hard to follow. We may want to look at some other ways of thinking about blurriness to help. So Soupy, for example, having a fluid structure with portions of the system flowing or mixing together, perhaps in a way which feels cloudy or even opaque. Sometimes our blurriness is like plurality, which can disguise itself to be more singlet-like in ways at times, though this isn't necessarily the same as median or mid-continuum systems. A Blendy system might have many headmates who are quite different from each other, but who don't always have distinct names, or who front mostly by blending. And we'd like to mention here that when things feel singlet-like a lot, in terms of the self-doubt that can come up, well, if plurality fits as a model for explaining mental phenomena, then why not use it? We found the essay Does It Work by Vicki's when discussing identity amnesia and some other points to be quite helpful in reassuring ourselves that our plurality is indeed plural, even though it can feel pretty singlet-like sometimes. Another way of looking at blurriness is that it can be a vague, slippery grayness when you're trying to find your footing within the territory of self, the domain of selfdom in your head. Kind of just an uncertainty you have to learn to roll with. More on that later. So let's talk about switching as a blurry system, especially because I think 3 or 4 of us have already shown up since we started recording, and those are different than the ones of us who were working on these slides earlier. Sometimes we only realize we've switched when it becomes apparent that who is fronting now isn't who was fronting an hour ago, even though at no point was it clear who was actually front. And there was a sense of continuity the whole time. Maybe our mental soup was merely stirred, or just had some ingredients added or removed. It can honestly be hard to tell passive influence or intrusion apart from blended fronting. For example, one headmate's affirming kink might be another headmate's trauma trigger, and when a trigger response shows up unexpectedly, we might have to study how persistent that is to figure out who was around front versus just kind of co-conscious in the back somewhere. And Rolodexing, or rapid switching, with a continuous sense of self but indistinct headmates, can be like a repeated cognitive whiplash as headmates with deeply contrasting emotions or very different communication styles keep trading off front. I'd like to talk about names in a blurry system, because quite a few of us don't seem to have names, including most of the folk who have worked on this presentation and recording. Many of us don't seem to have the ability to take or retain distinct names. And those of us that do have names sometimes have multiple separate forms who show up with the same name, but will also forget our names or be unable to access our names often. But I don't think that matters because there are ways of communicating and collaborating without names. There's an essay from a system with anonymous headmates, which had this insightful remark. We're equivalent to an anonymous messaging forum. You log on a few times a week and strike up conversations with whoever is around. You might recognize regular voices when chatting based on their interest or behavior, but for the most part, you don't care. We have found this particular insight to be quite helpful. You don't necessarily have to know someone's name to work with them, but that raises the question, how do you work with headmates if you can't address them? So we got the idea last year at Plural Positivity World Conference 2023 when we were watching the arcade's presentation about doing work as a polyfragmented system, about using mental buckets or groups to reference every headmate with a certain quality. For example, putting every headmate with a particular skill or trait into a bucket, or headmates with a certain belief or perspective into a bucket, or headmates with portions of memories from a particular event into a bucket, etc. For those familiar with abstract math and set theory, set builder notation can actually be used to model expressions like this. But what we found is that symbolic notation is really only good for taking notes and doing hypothetical exercises. Usually for the buckets to mean anything, we need some sort of emotional attachment to them to get headmates' attention, and not just abstract references like X or Y. So we might think about the set of all headmates who do our regular job duties at work. But in order to actually work with that, we may need to picture and feel like what it is to carry those duties out, and we might have to daydream that or actually act that out in order to reach those headmates internally. But our dissociative barriers mean that we can't reach every member of a group all the time, so leaving some follow-up notes for when there is a different front later can be crucial, and we'll touch more on examples of this a little later. But either an explanation of what headmates need to know, or some sort of pointer to find another headmate internally who wanted to discuss or share something, and that can be useful for inner reparenting. So when it can be hard to name specific folks in the system, how do you get the right person for the job? With the blurry structure and the lack of names, sometimes we know or maybe suspect that someone in the system has the right skills for some situation, for example, media literacy and reading between the lines, or sexuality and navigating consent, but we may not know who that is. Calling out internally for task-specific help can work sometimes even without names. For example, who knows about XYZ? But what about when someone doesn't wake up when you ask? Or what about when whoever is fronting doesn't know that anyone can help with something because they have amnesia about other selves in the system? Well, we're learning to leave reminders for ourselves, kind of like a skill chart. For example, we have selves who have written trauma fiction short stories we posted on Tumblr. Those selves are better at figuring out metaphor in fiction, so we might have an entry in a skill list about reading fiction, reading context, understanding metaphor, and it might suggest finding the selves inside who are the writers who have written the short stories, who have written about trauma in fiction, and those can be ways of finding those other selves. This can help folks near front who are struggling with something and who don't even realize that we might have the skills to deal with something find another headmate in the system who does have those skills. We are still working on identifying that we even have headmates with certain skills when regular fronters might not know, and being able to find reminders or tokens to wake those headmates up. But we are continuing to experiment. But one thing that comes up, what if front doesn't know that we're a blurry system and doesn't have the ability to recognize and visualize our inner structure in order to navigate that and find other selves to help them? So we've experimented with some mental imagery that works for different headmates to help them understand what our system is like. We imagine that the mind stuff that all of our selves are made of is like little components that can be connected together, although maybe the ways that they connect together change and adapt over time. And maybe this mind stuff forms fuzzy and indistinct shapes that are headmates, but these headmates might have vibrant color or texture that represents them in a unique way. As sometimes our mind has very distinct senses of self, but which can be hard to articulate or identify the inner boundaries of. But none of that makes any of ourselves any less real and alive. Further exploration of some of these kinds of ideas might be aided by looking at Emengard's Blobbies comic, or Chris's Lego Chris's page on Kinhost, both of which helped influence our self-understanding and self-visualization techniques. So how are we learning to navigate our inner blurriness? Our unclear structure and amnesic barriers means that a lot of making notes about tendencies and patterns can be helpful. Almost like doing a forensic analysis. When you didn't witness an actual event, you're just studying the evidence afterwards. And that can help give us a sense of what's going on in the system and what we might need to work on. Like if we see that half the time something is a trigger for the system, we may not know why it's a trigger or who is reacting exactly, but that doesn't stop us from working on trigger management and growth together. We want to give a quick warning about clinicians, because they may use the blurriness to discredit your plurality. In other words, learning to navigate this isn't just an inner struggle, because perceived inconsistencies around headmates might lead an uninformed clinician to attempt to fake claim you. There's an article by Stronghold about the ableist term imitated DID, which discusses more of that kind of fake claiming behavior from clinicians, which may be useful as a heads up. And having inner blurriness might make it hard to figure out exactly who is front, but front can still be studied in order to make decisions about trigger management, spoons management, and task distribution. Note that we say study front here to represent curiosity about the nature of the system, not to represent invasive, unwanted, over-analytical behaviors towards other headmates. If there's inner resistance about something, it could be a boundary and it could be trauma, so it's best not to poke, but rather foster an atmosphere of open communication. Alright, so how do you get a picture of who might be around front? Especially when folks might not have names or might have vague identities. Getting a picture of who's around front in order to manage spoons and manage triggers might be helped by checking very gently and cautiously for things which cause a strong emotional response. Does X or Y feel threatening to me right now, with triggers, for example? Does A or B sound like a good time or a doable activity? Be extremely careful mapping for triggers, but mapping these things, or which hobbies and passions sound interesting at the moment, what strong beliefs seem to be present, where sexual interests currently lie, can all help us figure out our current blend at front and how we need to navigate the world in this present moment. Something which we found very helpful was an answer the Corvidae Collective posted to a question that many had written in. And they stated, there's nothing wrong with not knowing who you are. You shouldn't feel obligated to know who is fronting just because you are supposed to. One tool they suggested is called Flowcharty, which is linked from Pluralpedia. Flowcharty walks through a sequence of questions to help elucidate who might be around front. Sometimes we imagine this mapping like a coordinate system, with various axes upon which we can measure the current blend at front. One axis might be gender, and that might include which body parts front is feeling dysphoric about. One axis might be our level of interest in socializing or other activities which feel more right or wrong for the current blend in front. And one axis might be our political alignment at the moment. Note that some of these traits are more static per headmate, some are more mood-based, like level of social interest, but that's all still relevant information to managing the present moment and the blend of selves participating in that moment. Just because social headmates are part of the blend at front, if they're not interested in socializing, then socializing wouldn't be a good choice of activity. So blended states can be frustrating, but they can also be beautiful and leveraged in our favor for growth. There can be benefits of several selves melding together. We have sometimes had luck using blended states to help headmates stuck in trauma time gain more awareness of the present day, or headmates who have been stuck in fight or flight responses for years in the back be able to borrow the calm, curious, open-minded state of other headmates, or to do reparenting internally. We have had quite a few headmates who need to learn healthier coping mechanisms, healthier ways of interacting with other humans, and healthier perspectives on the world, so reparenting can be helpful for that. Sometimes some of these singlet-focused self-help and therapy techniques are pretty adaptable to blended states. For example, it's not uncommon for singlets in therapy to role-play a situation and experiment with different ways that it could go. As a Blendy system, we've been able to try this with situations around trauma or triggers, kind of pulling the relevant headmates into the blend around front, because any headmate who wants or needs to join the dialogue can blend into front and participate for it. And it still tends to keep the headmates who started the exercise in the blend as well, allowing them to help directly provide a sense of safety and new perspective to the headmates who were previously stuck in distress. We will note, please exercise due caution when trying anything like this. We would personally recommend external support for role-playing any sort of trauma or trigger situation, whether that be a clinician or experienced plural peer or a loved one familiar with how to help you manage distress. There are some unexpected impacts of blending that it's helpful to be aware of. What we've found is that sometimes one of us thinks they're talking just to themselves about their own thoughts and feelings, but those thoughts and feelings are actually coming from another headmate that they're blended with. So any self-negative attitude showing up in that self-talk can unexpectedly worsen tensions between headmates in the system, because what one headmate thought was just self-talk, another headmate experienced as intra-system communication of a sort. Due to the lack of clarity around different selves and communication within the system, we also cannot quite tell whether intrusive thoughts are coming from other headmates or from our OCD. We've sometimes called this Schrodinger's intrusive thought, and we have to handle it carefully so we don't have the wave function collapse unexpectedly, so to speak. In other words, we have to simultaneously not let those thoughts take over mentally, calling out any toxicity or inner spiraling before it escalates, but while also treating irrational fears and disturbing imagery as possible communication attempts from other headmates who might be blended. So it might feel like my intrusive thought, but it's actually someone else who is in distress, and someone else who needs me to help them redirect towards stability and self-care, and grounding can really help with that. It's also important to note that reparenting headmates might feel indistinct from reparenting oneself. So it might feel like I'm talking to myself about how to handle something better, but another headmate is actually getting that, whether I'm aware of that or not. Another thing which has been kind of tricky is managing our amnesic barriers with our blurriness. So, while blendiness can lower barriers between headmates, it can introduce difficulties with getting things to stick because the system structure can shift around frequently and unpredictably. Doing system growth work might be more difficult when the headmates who need to work on particular issues are shifting fluidly in and out of front during that growth work session. Sometimes material objects which represent those issues can serve as anchors to encourage headmates to stay around. By using those objects repeatedly with grounding exercises throughout the growth work or skill practice or whatever we're trying to work on. So using anchors or landmarks, such as physical objects we see every day, to provide repetition, or playing with the time dimension again here, recurring calendar events that we're going to see regularly. After associating those things with relevant headmates or relevant topics, can help us get the right folks around when needed a little bit more easily, at least sometimes. We've also found that we can use anchors or landmarks like that to help broadcast bits of important information to reach the relevant headmates in the system, especially by leaving out sticky notes or putting something in our phone calendar which pops up over and over for a few weeks to make sure all the different folks who might wander in and out of front get caught up to speed when we don't have clear names for all the headmates we might need to inform about something. We've tried leaving notes for ourselves in our private Discord, but chat history scrolls off, so Discord is honestly better for having a searchable reference than for reminders, at least for us. And some more tips for system coordination and communication. We found that the less we worry about getting it perfect, the more productive our efforts seem to be. That's probably also due to our OCD. We found that when we journal, we often try not to worry about who is writing what exactly. Some headmates might change handwriting style or style of speech they use, or pick a different color of writing utensil. In fact, since some headmates prefer anonymity, they're more likely to make their contributions distinct if there isn't pressure to use a name. When we do use Discord, some headmates might pick random typing quirks or emojis, not ones they'd necessarily use every time, just ones they might use for the moment, to partially identify their portions of the conversation, rather than using the names we programmed into PluralKit. When journaling, we found that having lots of colors of pens and pencils is actually really good for blending, because maybe one headmate prefers bluer colors and one prefers greener colors, but they might use a variety of aquas and turquoises when blended. Similarly, sometimes Discord messages might combine several typing quirks or have several emojis. But overall, we mostly just have to remind ourselves to roll with being blendy and trust that our system will help us manage our life if we allow it to, rather than fighting it to be more specific and distinct. There's a few more thoughts about our blurriness that we would like to share, because there can be so much fluid handoff of things between headmates, including part of the way through tasks. Sometimes we've had to focus on learning things piecemeal, rather than trying to just force our way straight to the finish line. We're not just working on specific aspects of growth, learning specific skills or specific data, but also learning how to blend together at the right times to hand off parts of an activity or skill to the best headmates for the job, and that might not be apparent while we're learning. We deal regularly with suicidal ideation, and it took forever to realize that we had misunderstood how it worked most of the time. Because it seemed like we had a single fronter getting suddenly sucked into suicidality over something they usually handled fine. But actually, it often was passive influence from a headmate who had been awoken by a trigger and was feeling trapped due to being stuck in trauma time. Then, the triggered headmate would start blending in with the fronter. We would notice being dissociated from the present moment during those episodes, but it was unclear that this was often due to someone who was stuck in past trauma. We're actually working now on mapping those suicidal impulses to some of our past traumas in order to offer rescue to headmates who are in distress. We're practicing sending magic beacons to whoever might be trapped in a particular distress, since we might not be able to identify those individual headmates uniquely, and they can use those magic beacons to seek help from other headmates to help bring them up to speed on the present moment and our present safety. And in general, passive influence is the norm. It's basically a constant. There are very often multiple selves who are partially aware of the present moment and influencing front, resulting in a large number of combinations for front, which feel like a single headmate but are actually a mixture of several selves. Since we fooled ourselves into believing we were just a spicy singlet a lot of the time, we would actually like to leave you with our thoughts on collective identity with blurriness. Being trans, in particular, has been challenging. Headmates with different genders and different experiences of dysphoria might blend together to produce contradictory experiences sometimes. But being patient and looking at overarching patterns has been helpful in understanding our gender. Eric Yarborough points out in Transgender Mental Health at the end of the chapter on plurality, these evaluations may need to happen over time so the clinicians can look for the three major hallmarks of someone who can provide consent for treatment: insistency, consistency, and persistency. Collectively, medical and social transition has been very important to most of us, which is insistency. We have largely pursued femininity in the long term, which is consistency. And this has been a focus of ours for a long time now, which is persistency. So, despite some masculine headmates who occasionally blend into front and cause some confusion, we are collectively trans feminine and have transitioned in that way. Our personality traits are all over the place, but true friends don't seem to mind, at least. We also fluidly mask a lot of our inner natures by default. This was probably learned growing up neurodivergent and queer. This works out pretty well for our job, but we really have had to practice being more authentic by being more open with partners and close friends, but also trying to learn to prevent headmates stuck in past traumas from starting to just randomly trauma dump when we're trying to be open. And finally, we can't figure out if we have a collective fursona or separate fursonas or what. The only problem with this would be if we want to shop for a fursuit. But again, true friends don't mind that we're a little bit all over the road with who we are. So we would like to thank every many who attended. Thank you for taking the time out of your day for our presentation. We may be reached via email, and we would love to hear from other systems who experience a lot of blendiness and blurriness. If any of our ideas work for other systems or don't work for other systems, it would be great to hear about it. Again, all of the URLs in the slides are available via that pastebin link, which is also accessible via that QR code. And thank you, every many, for your time.